Thank you very much, Joanna, and may I say what a very great pleasure it is for me to be able to speak to you at this 21st Berlin Conference on Refugee Rights. I did listen to a little bit of the earlier session, so I heard something of the flavour of the debate, and it's a great honour for me to be part of it. I was very happy to be invited to speak because I very much liked your title, the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention, more relevant than ever. Well, of course, as the Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees with the UN Refugee Agency, I firmly believe that the Convention has enduring value, and indeed the COVID pandemic of the last 18 months has shown that the core principles of the Convention are more relevant than ever. Well, I've been asked to speak particularly about the principle of non-refoulement as a core principle of the Convention that establishes a non-derogable obligation on states never to return a refugee to a place of persecution or violence. While I would like to discuss what I believe are unprecedented challenges posed to the normative values of the Refugee Convention, I'd like to begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as we can get, knowing that, of course, asylum is a centuries-old tradition of nations and even city-states. So in 1951, the founding nations of the Refugee Convention were concerned to protect about 2 million people who remained displaced and without protection 6 years after the Second World War. Today, as we celebrate the 70th anniversary, the UN Refugee Agency has a vastly increased mandate covering over 82.4 million refugees and people who are displaced in their own countries, plus unknown millions of those who are stateless. Over the last 10 years, for example, the number of those forcibly displaced in the world has doubled, reflecting well-known root causes: violence, intercommunal conflict, environmental degradation, poverty, inability to find livelihoods, inequality, especially for women and girls, discrimination, and natural disasters and climate change. Well, the Convention and its 1967 protocol defines who is a refugee and sets out the protection, assistance and social rights a refugee is entitled to receive. For its time, of course, a breakthrough agreement in international law recognizing the social and economic rights of refugees as a special group in needing a high level of protection. The Convention also recognized the need for international cooperation to ease what was recognized in 1951 as an unequal burden on host nations. And the Convention rests on two principles that I'm sure everyone listening to this will be well aware of: the right to seek and enjoy asylum, stated of course in the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and the absolute prohibition on returning a refugee to a place of danger or persecution. Well, today, 70 years later, 149 states are party to either the Convention or the Protocol, or both, reflecting what I think is fairly to be said a global consensus on the humanitarian values of the Convention itself, many of which will have customary law status and are binding on all nations, whether party to the Convention or not. But the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention is a time of reflection. What has the Convention achieved? And perhaps even more importantly, is it able to respond effectively to the contemporary needs of those forcibly displaced today, and will it be able to do so in the future? Well, first, it's undoubted that commitments to the Convention have saved millions of lives over these last decades, and even in this time of COVID. There are currently 26.4 million registered refugees hosted in countries around the world, testament to the generosity of these host countries that have clearly endorsed the fundamental principles of the Convention in word and in deed. Despite the need for measures to protect public health, most states have ensured that their borders remain open to asylum seekers, providing them with protection and adopting digital technologies to ensure asylum processing continues in this time of COVID. The Refugee Convention has also inspired regional agreements such as the 1969 Organization of African Union's Refugee Convention and the 1984 Cartagena Declaration for Latin America, along with a common asylum system for the European Union. Well, very broadly, then, these are the successes of the Refugee Convention, their enduring power to ensure that all governments agree to the normative provisions and will certainly in word, if not always deed, respect those fundamental provisions. But my second question is whether the Refugee Convention is capable of responding to contemporary and future challenges. And there's no doubt at all that the Refugee Convention today faces challenges to those fundamental norms and to its effectiveness. And I'd like to just give you some examples of where I think these challenges lie. One that is particularly important is that nearly 90% of refugees and, of course, displaced people internally are hosted by poor and developing neighbouring countries, typically in the global south, while relatively small and manageable numbers find their ways to Europe and other safe havens. Only 15% of refugee flows go to industrialised nations. Many refugee determination processes are weak, resulting in backlogs over many years, placing asylum seekers in a legal vacuum in which it's hard to be included meaningfully in their host state communities. Those asylum seekers who are found by tribunals and rule of law based processes, where they're found not to be in need of international protection, it's one of the current challenges, defects of the current system, that all too often they cannot be returned for practical purposes to their country of origin, which of course undermines the integrity of the asylum regime itself. For example, the conflict in Syria is now entering its 11th year. 3.6 or 7 million Syrian refugees have been hosted for that period of time generously by Turkey, but it remains extremely dangerous for these asylum seekers to return. So that somebody who fails in their application for refugee status, for practical purposes, won't be returned in any event. Many political leaders, and I think this was mentioned in the previous session, many political leaders conflate migrants with asylum seekers and refugees for populist political gain, and that's proving to be immensely dangerous for advocacy for the special rights of those who are determined to be refugees. Some countries attempt to transfer their protection obligations to other, usually poor countries and isolated islands, detaining asylum seekers in poor conditions indefinitely and ultimately arbitrarily. And I return to that point of externalization of obligations. The realities also have changed in the time of COVID. I think UNHCR is perhaps known in the wider community for its ability to propose resettlement of refugees to host countries. But this last year of COVID, we have been able to submit for resettlement fewer than 23,000 people, the lowest that UNHCR has ever been able to submit in the last 20 years. We are, of course, optimistic that these numbers will rise in this year and particularly next year as, for example, the United States develops and rebuilds its asylum capacity and its political willingness to achieve a much higher number of people who are being resettled. There's also been a 45% decrease in new asylum applications, the biggest drop again in over 20 years. One of the other elements that we're dealing with today, one of the burdens, the obstacles, are the conflicts that remain protracted and seemingly irresolvable, so that voluntary returns are virtually impossible. Afghanistan is entering its 5th decade. The conflict in Syria continues. Discrimination and statelessness of the Rohingya in the context of Myanmar has been going on for decades, with a recent, of course, action by the military against the Rohingya, leading them to leave about 1 million to the hospitality of Bangladesh. We also have continued displacements and moving across boundaries in the Sahel, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or we have new conflicts in Tigray in Ethiopia and the recent displacement of 1 million in Mozambique. But my point is that those that we would hope to have gone home, and most refugees want to return home, are simply not able to do so. We've also found that the impact of COVID has been particularly disproportionate for migrants and refugees generally, because those who are irregular in a country, particularly asylum seekers whose claims have not been assessed, do not have access to livelihoods, or they're the first to lose their jobs if they have one, and are vulnerable to evictions, to very high rates of domestic violence, exploitation of children, child marriages and child pregnancies, and of course about half of refugee children are not in school at all, and the great concern is that girls will not return. At the height of the pandemic, 165 countries closed their borders, and about 99 denied access totally without exception to asylum processes. Today that number's about 55, where countries refuse access for asylum claims. So these are some of the challenges that the Refugee Convention faces. But one that is really the topic I've been asked in particular to speak about concerns the principle of non-refoulement. You'll all know that refugee law and UNHCR's role is built upon the principle of non-refoulement, a principle that's enjoyed almost unanimous international adherence over the last 70 years. But today, this principle is under serious threat. Can I give you perhaps a few examples, though, of the strength of the principle before I explain where it is being threatened? The Refugee Convention has been picked up in subsequent human rights treaties and regional human rights instruments. For example, in the 1984 Convention Against Torture, which prohibits the removal of a person to a country where there are substantial grounds for believing that they will be in danger or subject to torture. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, as interpreted by the Human Rights Committee, also encompasses an obligation not to extradite, deport, expel, or otherwise remove a person from their territory, and where there are substantial grounds for believing that there is a risk of irreparable harm. This again will be a breach of that convention, and is in essence a form of principle of non-refoulement. And there are other examples. But sadly, over this last year in particular, UNHCR has observed numerous violations of the principle of non-refoulement. Of course, one of the things that's been important to recognize about UNHCR is that we have 550 field offices and operations. So that means that we are very close to the ground. We've got a better opportunity to understand what is happening, even though there may be diplomatic and political denials. And we know with very credible evidence that in many parts of the world there are increased and often violent pushbacks at borders and interceptions at sea that have been reported, including in circumstances that amount to a breach of the non-refoulement provision, and certainly breach of other elements of human rights law. Now, it's quite true that when a state is confronted with allegations that they are in breach of the non-refoulement principle, they will always deny it. They will say they will always act within the core principles of the Refugee Convention, and that they will always respect the principle of non-refoulement. So we have, in a sense, a very difficult diplomatic environment where we know, as a matter of fact, that these refoulements are occurring, but very difficult to deal with governments that deny this is happening at all, which is why, as we all know, hard facts and evidence are really crucial to good advocacy and to ensure that the human rights and refugee law principles are maintained. But in addition to the pushbacks that we've become sadly so familiar with, we are seeing countries denying disembarkation of asylum seeker boats in the Mediterranean, in the Andean Sea and the Bay of Bengal, rejecting centuries of the maritime tradition of rescue at sea. Well, these developments have the potential to undermine the international protection regime, a rather sobering observation in this 70th year since the 1951 Convention was adopted, during which it has provided genuine protection for so many refugees. One very quick point that I'd like to return to is another threat, which is another form of breach of the non-refoulement principle, and that is what at a general level we'll describe as the phenomenon of externalization. A number of countries, and I won't say a trend, but there's certainly a number of countries that are adopting what you might call a zero asylum policy. They will not allow people to arrive in irregular ways, and they will attempt to shift the burden of responsibility to those people to third countries, and typically poor, dependent countries in the global south, again, where, of course, the greatest burden lies among host countries. There are many examples, both by the United States, by Australia, but more recently, we're seeing it being discussed by European countries, which was entirely unexpected. And you may all be familiar with the legislation just recently passed by Denmark, the idea being that Denmark would not allow any asylum seeker access to territory for the purpose of making their claim, but rather they would then be airlifted to another country, which would then take on the responsibility for assessing that asylum claim. Now, there are many models and styles of ways in which externalization can take place, but we at the United Nations Refugee Agency are firmly opposed to these forms of externalization, primarily because the countries to which the exercise of the obligation to assess an asylum claim are likely to be transferred are countries that themselves are struggling with their own asylum systems, where they do not always have the safeguards in place, and where we would expect that asylum seekers would be detained and certainly not given the rights to which they're entitled. So this is a very worrying shift, in other words, from typically Western resource-rich states back typically to African states in the context of Denmark, and we are deeply concerned about this initiative. Even though, of course, there will always be statements by the respective states shifting the burden that they will do so with relevant safeguards. So the question that I'd like to finish with then is, well, what are the solutions? How can the Refugee Convention remain relevant for the decades to come? And the answer, I'd suggest, lies in the Global Compact on Refugees, accepted by the overwhelming majority of nations in 2018, accepted by 181 nations in the General Assembly. The Compact is something of a breakthrough. It is not binding legally. It's very readily accessible, easily to read, written in plain English, and I imagine also in plain German, or plain French, or Italian, or Mandarin. But the key point is that it's a new approach. It's not a hard law treaty, but it's a new way of bringing together states so that they will share equitably the responsibility for refugees and those forcibly displaced. The other rather novel aspect of the covenant has been that it's brought in a wider international community of stakeholders, civil society, the international and national NGOs, but perhaps unusually the private sector, the international banking sector, individual parliamentarians, faith-based groups, scholars, as we have today, city mayors, local governments. These are also now committed to the compact to support host nations and to enable refugees to be self-sufficient in the countries in which they've found refuge. These are not abstract ideals. They're to be implemented through the more than 1,400 pledges made by governments and civil societies and other stakeholders. Their impacts will be assessed by evidence and by data, and indeed we'll all have our feet to the fire to be sure that these are not just promises, empty promises, but are pledges that will deliver support, particularly to host countries and to the self-sufficiency of refugees. And in December this year, we'll hold a high-level officials meeting in Geneva to take stock of progress in implementing the pledges and to plan for a future global refugee forum. So I think these are very important initiatives, and they're ones that I think can take us into the future, building on the core principles of the Refugee Convention itself, but advancing it by expanding the community, the international community in their commitment to the principles, and ensuring we have some equitable sharing of responsibilities. Perhaps I could finish by saying that there's one threat that I haven't said very much about, but it's a priority, we think, here at the UN Refugee Agency for the future, maybe the number one priority, and that is that when the scourge of the COVID pandemic lifts, when it finally subsides, we'll see the impact of climate change and natural disasters on the mass displacements of people, exacerbating, of course, other factors of poverty that I've described, but driving people to seek other lands, to seek opportunities, leading often to further conflict. So we think that this is one of the challenges that the Refugee Convention and the Global Compact will need to rise to, and we think there are already indications in the jurisprudence of the International Committee, the Human Rights Committee, that climate-related disasters can have an impact on displacement, threatening the life of a person, and that might give them some basis for making a claim for asylum in the future. So may I conclude then with a very obvious point perhaps, and that is that the most effective way to ensure refugee protection lies in ensuring that nations and the international community respect and implement both the Compact and the 51 Convention in practice. If I may say so, Germany has of course been a leader in refugee protection over many years, and we hope it will continue to be such a strong voice at the European level to promote solidarity, fair treatment, and to uphold the rights of all those who need protection in the international community. Thank you very much.